Next on Newsmax Prime, the reaction to Russia. What is America's response to Putin's intervention in Syria, and what should it be? We'll talk to the former head of Central Intelligence. Then, the not-so-secret service. Why did the agency charged with protecting federal officials seek to leak information critical of this congressman? Plus, presidential politics. Experts weigh in on the Trump tax plan and part 4 of my exclusive interview with John Kasich. Newsmax Prime starts now. Good evening and welcome to Newsmax Prime. Of prime interest tonight, the USA in disarray. Once again, the Obama administration appears confused and surprised by Russian moves in Syria. And apparently, the Russians are not alone. Miranda Khan has more from our newsroom. Miranda?
Lebanese sources tell Reuters that hundreds of Iranian troops arrived in Syria and soon will join Syrian government forces and the Lebanese Hezbollah in a, quote, major ground offensive that will be backed by those Russian airstrikes. Meanwhile, more differing opinions after yesterday's airstrikes over who Russia was really targeting and who's telling the truth.
There is a logical contradiction in the Russian position and now its actions in Syria. Russia states an intent to fight ISIL on the one hand and to support Bashar al-Assad and his regime on the other.
Did you say something about Pentagon?
Yes, they've been questioning your targets and motives in Syria.
Everything was said by the Russian Ministry of Defense. Don't listen to Pentagon about the Russian strikes.
And as pointed out by former Congressman and friend of the program, Michael Flanagan, this conflict is starting out with advisors and proxy armies. It may remind many of us of another similar battle that we eventually were drawn into for many years. That, of course, Vietnam. JD, back to you.
Thanks, Miranda. For more on this story, we welcome the former Director of Central Intelligence, Ambassador James Woolsey, who is also the chairman of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Likewise, joining us, Fred Fleitz, Senior Vice President for Policy and Programs at the Center for Security Policy. Fred served as a CIA analyst in the past. Both these gentlemen join us from Newsmax, Washington. Ambassador, first to you, your assessment of just what's been going on in Syria and the American reaction or the lack thereof.
Well, I think we've been in a position not of leading from behind, but from wandering around behind, where the United States is not being taken seriously by a number of people. Our friends wonder why we've turned against them, like the Israelis and Mubarak when he was taken into custody, and our enemies are pleased. So I think we're in as bad a situation with respect to the management of a major international crisis as we've been in modern times.
And Fred, if we take a look at what can only be called a contradiction, I mean, there was John Kerry talking tough in the Security Council last night, then getting together with a Russian foreign minister and having a very different message. Do the Russians just expect an inherently weak response from the Obama administration?
I think that's exactly right, JD. They've seen a non-policy by President Obama in Syria where he clearly didn't want to do anything and wants to kick this crisis to the next president. All these red lines and ultimatums issued to various nations, including Russia, that we haven't followed up on. I got to tell you, when the word of the President of the United States means nothing, we're going to live in a very dangerous world.
And in uncertain times, there are still echoes of history. Miranda referenced my old congressional colleague, Michael Patrick Flanagan, who was talking about proxy states, military advisors, and the specter of Vietnam in the 1960s. Are there any similarities to that, or what should we be mindful of in terms of history and the current American response in Syria, Jim?
Well, I turned against Vietnam after 4 years and organized the Eugene McCarthy campaign in New Haven, so I was on both sides that war, first one and then the other. So I have some sympathy for both points of view, but I got to say that not all involvements are get you bogged down. For example, in Kosovo, back in 1999, the Kosovars were being massacred by the Serbs, and Bill Clinton, who had been very, very sorry that he had not intervened in Rwanda to stop the mass killings there, intervened in Kosovo, and instead of 10 or 12 sorties a day, the way we're bombing now in Syria and Iraq, we were using hundreds of sorties a day. It took 88 days, I think, and Milosevic died in prison. And in Kosovo's capital, Pristina, there's a Bill Clinton Avenue. So sometimes when you help and do the thing that would save lives, you get bogged down and it doesn't work well. And Vietnam certainly was, at least in part, a case like that. But it can also go the other way. It can go a good way if you do it right.
All right, well, I think Fred and I are both astounded, Jim, that you got clean for Gene in 1968 in that campaign. But Fred, things are getting murky, all kidding aside. Russia now says no way it joins our alliance to fight ISIS. Have they just basically said, here's what we're going to do and you're going to like it?
Well, the Russians are taking advantage of a power vacuum, but there's a bigger issue here. We shouldn't be talking about partnering with Russia or Iran to resolve the situation in Iraq and Syria, since they have an agenda that is completely incompatible with ours in regional security. If we do this, we're going to let Iran and Russia form a new regional axis that we will pay a heavy price for this for years to come. We need a new, much stronger alliance of regional states and European states to counter Russian and Iranian influence.
Gentlemen, 3 minutes remain, and speaking of strong alliances, heretofore the American-Israeli alliance has been strong, but now there are quite frankly some problems. Today at the United Nations, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had a lot to say about the Iran deal, including what to expect once the sanctions are lifted. Here's a portion of his impassioned address at the UN earlier today.
Unleashed and unmuzzled, Iran will go on the prowl, devouring more and more prey. You think Iran is doing that to advance peace? You think hundreds of billions of dollars in sanctions relief and fat contracts will turn this rapacious tiger into a kitten? If you do, you should think again.
Jim, you hear the Prime Minister's words. He lays it out in a way that is very stark and tells us what may be at hand in the days ahead.
Well, I'm substantively in agreement completely with Bibi on this. I think we've behaved in exactly the way that he's criticizing, and I think that we've made life a lot harder and more dangerous for Israel, that is right in the middle of this morass. And I think by the way we've handled that Iranian deal on nuclear systems and nuclear weapons, we've created a situation in which Iran, if it doesn't already have a nuclear weapon somewhere up in the desert, will have one in relatively short order. Other countries will join it. And the next time we have a major crisis in the Middle East involving 4, 5, 6 countries, 2 or 3, maybe 4 or 5 of them will have nuclear weapons. And that's not a peaceful thing.
Not only is that out there, the specter of that horror with nuclear proliferation, but Fred, there's something more simple and basic here. Given the on-again, off-again uncertainty of the current administration, do you believe Prime Minister Netanyahu, Fred, is ready to go it alone? Do you think he even counts on the U.S. for support from the current administration? 20 seconds to answer that, Fred.
I think he is prepared to go it alone because he's seen such inconsistent policy and such hostility towards Israel by this president. I'm afraid that's where things are.
Gentlemen, we will continue to monitor these developments. For now, we thank you for your time. Ambassador Jim Woolsey and Fred Fleitz, who joined us from Newsmax Washington. Coming up, our intelligence community still dealing with fallout from those reported faulty assessments on ISIS. Senator Ron Johnson and the aforementioned MP Flanagan will join us. Stay with us.